Hey Bombardiers, for episode 250, we have a special guest who was on last time, I believe, November of 2014, so it's been a while, but he is the composer of games such as Star Wars The Old Republic, and recently he did Mafia 3, and we have back to the show, Mr. Jesse Harlin.
Good morning.
Morning, and it's been a long time since you were on, and some people thought you were on just like a couple months ago, but no, it's been like a year and a half.
That's crazy. I actually thought the same. I was like, wait, 2014. Surely it was 2015 sometime.
No, it was 2014. It's been a long time.
Wow. All right.
But there's definitely a lot to talk about because, from your first soundtrack release was Mafia 3. Congratulations to that one.
Thank you.
And then, of course, this year, I don't know why, but EA's pretty much just said this is the year of Star Wars The Old Republic with one of the most acclaimed expansions, at least most hyped expansions I've seen for that game ever. And there's been quite a few good ones and big ones that you did a lot of work on with the music.
Yeah, I mean, if we haven't talked since 2014, then that means that Knights of the Fallen Empire and
Shadow of
Revan, yeah, and the upcoming Knights of the Eternal Throne. That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I guess this one question I'm going to ask right off the bat is, you've done music for this game for, let's see, did it come out December 2011 or 2012?
2011.
2011, and of course you were doing music for, they developed that game for years before it actually came out.
That's right.
How do you still keep it, first, fresh?
Yeah.
So, you don't retread stuff, but at the same time, keep it new so you don't bore yourself with just retreading things. Keep it fresh, and of course, at the same time, keep it attached to the sound that's already been established for the game. How do you balance that when you continue to pump out more and more music for a game that's just ever expanding?
That's a great question. Because, I've been in the game industry for 17 years. And I've been working on Star Wars The Old Republic for 8 years. So about half of my career has been spent on this one game. So how do you keep it fresh? I think part of it is that I love Star Wars and have loved it my whole life. So anytime the development team comes to me and says something like, okay, for Shadow of Revan, we're going to have a new planet, and that planet is going to be Yavin 4. There's that, 6-year-old inside of me that then gets instantly giddy about the callback to the original film and the fact that, there have been Yavin has shown up in a couple of games here and there, but now I get to do my take on music for Yavin, and I get to really play around with it and see what I can do. And so that's exciting in part. But then, then there's the sort of more workmanship answer, which is just that, by now we've established a fairly standard sort of pattern for what we do with the planet. So anytime there's a new planet, I know that I need to set about trying to find one signature sound that's going to be it's going to be the thing that says that you're on Yavin. So, and I forgive me if I talked about this with you in 2014, but each planet has its own signature instrument. So for Nal Hutta, it was tuba. For Nar Shaddaa, it was marimba, but not just marimba. We actually decided to do serialism marimba. Serialism is this weirdo 20th century composition technique that makes things sound generally unlistenable. um, but we decided to use it on Nar Shaddaa because um, nothing says pleasure casino planet like impenetrable classical music. Um, so anyway, so when it came to like Yavin, Yavin was bass recorder, medieval bass recorder, because I wanted something that sounded low and woody, and that was a good instrument for it. And I can experiment a bit more when we're not recording a live instrument with some more sort of obscure and weird instruments like bass recorder, because I don't have to worry about trying to find somebody who can play that. For Fallen Empire and Eternal Throne, we've recorded with an orchestra in Nashville, which has been really amazing. But then when, for like Shadow of Revan and in fact the stuff that came before Shadow of Revan, like Oricon and Kawat and whatnot, I was still having a lot of fun working with some instruments that I couldn't do if we were going to do live instruments, getting to do stuff with samples that I might not have been able to do otherwise. Like Kawat, for instance, the main theme for that has PVC pipe played as a percussion instrument. So, that's not the kind of thing that you can expect the percussion section of an orchestra to be able to do. They could do it but you'd probably have to give them time in advance to figure out how to do it. But doing it with samples is the most cost-effective and I think smart way to do it.
And one thing I've noticed is as you said with Fallen Empire and so on, like the music is a lot more. Well, you can tell when something's live because it fills your if you have good sound equipment, it fills your ears pretty well, and the sound is more whole, and you don't. Sometimes with samples, I think it's the horns I tend to notice the most.
Horns are the hardest, no question. And
drums are pretty easy to do. They just sound sometimes too perfect.
Drums are super easy to do, and in fact, you are probably unaware of how frequently percussion is still samples, even if there is an orchestra. Many times people will record live strings and brass, and then still use samples for things like woodwinds and percussion.
And especially mallet percussion, I've noticed is a lot of the times samples, but
yes.
Probably because it sounds pretty close.
It sounds it does. It sounds very close. Yeah. And
you don't have to worry about the shrill glockenspiel thing.
Exactly. And the problem with stuff like that is that when you record all that together, the glockenspiel, things like timpani or snare, those things, they bleed into all of the other microphones of the rest of the orchestra. So when you get into mixing and you're wanting to try and isolate, let's get a little bit more out of the flute. So often you'll hear like, well, we can only get so much out of the flute because we're actually even though the xylophone is on the other side of the room and has its own microphone, you're still getting xylophone bleed into the flute mics. So a lot of the times people will record the percussion in an isolation booth away from everybody else, but when you do that, now it sounds separate, so you have to recreate the sound of the room by use of reverb units. And once you're doing that, then it becomes a question of like, well, why am I bothering to do all of this? Because my samples sound identical to what we're doing anyway, and then I still have to fake putting the xylophone samples into the room. So why am I bothering? So it's a constant give and take. Orchestral recording is a long process of compromise.
Is that why during a lot of concerts and so on, sometimes you see like those little glass walls in front of like drum sets and some of the percussion instruments just to block some of the sound back?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it's twofold, because you'll see those sorts of walls up between the percussionists and everyone else, and between the French horns and the percussionists, because the French horns, their bells point backwards at the percussion players. So you're still working on isolating everybody from each other.
And that leads me to horns, which this is a comment from a listener. They said, listening to Oricon, which is the music for the Dread Masters, which is something that people were really looking forward to after the original game. You get to see them, and then you get to actually play that stuff. They said that you did what Hans Zimmer did with Inception, but better, with the giant blaring horn. With Oricon, and from what I've seen on YouTube, that is like that is the song that has the most responses positively from everyone. Where they're just like, we need more of this in my life.
Yeah.
So coming up with music for Dread Masters, for these awesomely terrible Sith Lords in a pretty powerful planet, it seems like you just let loose in a way that you haven't done in most of those other worlds that you've been able to score. Is that a true assessment for that world?
Yeah, I would also say that the music for Oricon is maybe one of the ones that's I stepped further to the side of your sort of traditional Star Wars score for it. So it's you get these times when you're scoring this stuff where you try and stay either rigidly within the boundaries of Star Wars as it's been previously established, or you try and move the needle a little. And I have never been one to be shy when it comes to moving the needle. And so I love trying to play around with things, so it's always great when fans react positively to it, because there have been times where I've tried things and people haven't responded positively to it. So I'm glad that people dig the Oricon music, because that was a lot of fun to experiment with.
So when you're writing music for a giant Sith Lord and this planet that terrible things are happening on, is it more of they tell you what to expect on this world and you come up with the music, or is it sort of a give and take where they say we need this sort of sound and you come up with that sound, and then they say we like this, enhance this? How is the give and take on something like that one, or do you have a lot of freedom just to say this is the sound of these Dread Masters, let's go for it, loud horns, let's blare it?
I had a lot of freedom. It wasn't so much that they requested anything. They just told me about the Dread Masters and told me what they were like and what the planet was going to be like. It was going to be this like volcanic, crazy, primordial world. Um, and then I just went and came up with ideas, and when I sent it to them, they loved it, and that was it. There wasn't any back and forth. It was just, hey, how about this? Hey, that sounds great. So for me, I had two ideas basically. So the first idea was, what would it sound like if I were to try and do a... It's going to sound funny because in the end it doesn't sound anything like it, but what would it sound like if I was trying to do Star Wars meets Godzilla? Is where the idea came from originally. And then but that was without listening to any Godzilla music or anything. This was just, sitting there thinking to myself, I wonder what it would be like to do the Star Wars version of a giant monster movie. And so then I went and I took a listen to some Godzilla music, and it wasn't at all what I was expecting it to sound like. So then I thought, okay, forget that. So let me instead do, what would it sound like if it were Star Wars music meets what I thought Godzilla might sound like. And so when I started thinking about, how would I represent a monster movie in Star Wars, I decided upon this idea of, let me take every instrument that can play at the very bottom of the orchestra's range, and let me try and have them all play as buzzy and brassy and raspy as they possibly can, all way just down at the bottom, and just create this low, growling, raspy, farting sound. And so it was, not just contrabasses, but contrabasses playing tremolo, where they're basically scraping the strings back and forth, and not just bass trombones, but bass trombones playing with this like flutter tongue kind of buzzy technique, and not just contrabassoon, but contrabassoon also doing flutter tonguing effects. And so everything was about getting a buzzy, oh, I just blew into the mic, sorry. This big, bold sound. And I then wanted to offset that by the second half of the theme, which is this like kind of these waves, these oncoming waves of strings that just kind of wash over you. And that's where it came from, really.
And it came to great effect. And ironically, you said how you're trying to do, Godzilla meets Star Wars, and the Star Wars movie we get in December is composed by the Godzilla composer.
Right.
So maybe we will get some Godzilla meets Star Wars.
Yeah, who knows?
We have no idea what we're going to get from this blah.
Right.
I'm hoping it'll be good, but actually I kind of expect it to be.
I expect it
to be a good composer.
Yeah.
And then you can see what Godzilla meets Star Wars really sounds like.
Yeah, right? Yeah.
So one thing you mentioned how you had a lot of the technique stuff for this song. When you're recording with live orchestra or so on, how much pushback sometimes do you get from not just I know they can sight read the music pretty well, but when you put a lot of technique instructions on the music, how much pushback do you sometimes get from live musicians just going, what?
None, really. They are there to do a job, and they are happy to do it. There are only a couple of times where traditionally they will complain about something, and that is there's a string technique called coleño, where you are asking them to turn their bows upside down and bonk on the strings with the hard wood part of their bow. They don't like doing that. It's not good for their instruments. So they will fight back against that. There's you can get an approximation of that sound by having them bounce pencils off of the strings. So they will do that much happier than they will hit their bows against their instruments, because these instruments are sometimes centuries old, and they don't like you asking them to then take their century-old instrument and hit it with a stick. And I get that. And then the only time that I've specifically heard that they complained to anyone was actually when we were doing the recording session for Star Wars 1313. And it wasn't anything to do with performance techniques. It's that we were trying some different things in terms of the production of it. And so John Rod, who was the recording engineer and then mix engineer as well, he was placing microphones in places that orchestras typically don't have microphones placed. So he was front micing French horns as well as rear micing French horns. And when he was setting microphones up in front of them, the orchestra was getting really grumpy about feeling like it was too invasive and that there were too many microphones, and that they didn't like how, they didn't like that they had to now be extra careful about extra equipment in their way. That's the only time that I know specifically that anyone's ever complained.
When it came to recording live for Fallen Empire, did you get to direct the orchestra, or was that like a Gordy Hobb or someone else?
Yeah, Gordy and I were both in the booth in Nashville, and a guy named David Ships was the conductor. And I can't conduct for the life of me. I'm terrible at it. So I much prefer to be in the booth. And so Gordy and I were both in the booth together, co-directing the session, taking notes, and after each take, hey, do you have any notes? Hey, did you hear anything? Oh, this sounds good. Let's make sure we get, bars 8 to 15 again, that sort of thing. And that's how we did both Fallen Empire and Eternal Throne. And it works really well.
Yeah, I one thing I've noticed when it comes to composers, they either really like directing, like a Jack Wall is really good at doing that. He did it with Video Games Live, or they like being in the booth to coach, because they can make corrections easier in the booth than they can because they're listening to how it sounds. And so it sounds like you're the type of one that would rather just listen to your stuff and coach it from there rather than flailing your arms in front of people.
Yeah, it really is. And the other thing that I like about being in the booth is that you can talk more honestly about the music as it's being made. There is a certain amount of diplomacy that a conductor has to do that the composer in the booth doesn't have to worry about. I can say through the talkback mic directly to the conductor, I can say, like, hey, we need to go grab the last 4 bars because the trombones chunked it, and instead he can translate that into something diplomatic for the trombone players, and so I don't have to worry about that too much.
yeah, I can understand that. So, I know when this whole project started, we talked about last time how there was a lot of composers because there was a lot of music to do.
Yes.
And people still think Mark Gritzky's doing the music, which I was looking at comments like he hasn't done it for a while, at least not full time.
Not full time, but Mark actually is still writing music for it. Mark worked on about 5 tracks for Eternal Throne, and Mark also did music on Shadow of Revan.
Well, doesn't he do it as a you need help, call him in type thing versus?
Yes.
Because you and Gordy Hobb are the main 2 now, right?
Correct. There's a third guy. It's 3 of us that are the main 3 guys. The other guy is a guy named Henry Wilkinson that Gordy introduced me to, and Henry's really great.
Okay. So I was just saying, like, with other people there with you, does that help you also keep music fresh and going? Because they have other people can come and bring in ideas. They go, I did not think about it that way, and then you could, like new themes or new ways to approach music with more ears on the set.
Yes, absolutely. So, for instance, I have since the launch, I've typically been the one to come up with most of the thematic material. So Oricon and Rishi and Yavin and the main themes for all the characters for not Eternal Throne, for Fallen Empire, all that stuff has been pieces that I wrote. However, for Knights of the Eternal Throne, I said to Gordy, "Hey Gordy, I've been doing all these themes. Would you be interested in doing the main theme for Eternal Throne?" And he said absolutely. So he jumped at the chance to do that, and just so happened that BioWare made a specific request that for Eternal Throne they wanted the main theme to then be woven through tons of the material for this particular expansion. So it was interesting because Gordy wrote his main theme, and then it's the reverse of what I've usually had to do, where I'll write the character themes for, say, Arcan or Valkorion, and then I get to see how other people treat them. And this time it was the other way around. So Gordy wrote the main theme for the Eternal Throne, and then myself and Henry and Mark, who was back writing some music, and even Wilbert Roger was back writing a couple cues this time around. So it was interesting to see then how everybody was taking and working with Gordy's theme.
Okay, here's a listener question that I think will apply. They said in 2006 or 2007 you wrote an article for a gaming magazine called Smart Combat Music.
Yes.
And I believe that was after Republic Commando and some of the games like that when they did. I just want to know, has your view on Smart Combat Music evolved since then with your work on the Old Republic and now with Mafia and some of the other titles you've worked on? Has it evolved or changed, or has it stayed the same?
I think it stayed the same. I think my approach to how to... So let me see if I can remember. This is now 10 years ago that I wrote that article. The article itself was about how combat music needs to... It's not enough for there to just be a binary system of is combat happening or is combat not happening? Are you being attacked or are you not? Are you threatened or are you not? Binary and binary alone doesn't cut it. And back in 2006, this was a very common thing. So you were either in combat and combat music would play, or you were out of combat, and when you were out of combat, combat music would just fade out and go away. wrote this article, and the article was about how combat music needs to not only have multiple layers to it, low combat, high combat, and when I say low and high, I mean in intensity, but that you need to pay attention through the implementation of a game in terms of what combat means to the player at a particular point in time. That the very first time someone is in combat in a game, it doesn't matter how many enemies there are. There could be 1, there could be 4, there could be 500. No matter what it is, that should be a high-intensity combat track. Because it's the first time they've been in combat, they're going to feel untested, they're going to feel nervous about whether they'll survive that combat or not. The next time that person is in combat is different, because the next time they're in combat, they've survived the first time they were in combat. And that means that they have a level of confidence, they feel that the idea of character life and death has diminished, because they have survived, so they know they can do it again. And so there's this concept that every single encounter afterwards, well, I shouldn't say every single encounter, every single small skirmish after the first encounter will be won't have the same level of intensity, won't have the same fear element that it does otherwise. So that's what the article was about. And so I think that all of that is still very applicable. And when I'm designing interactive music systems for games, I still take that into account. I'm just changing now how to approach that sort of thing. So in 2016, we have in the game industry very robust music middleware that we can call upon in game engines now that didn't really exist in 2006. And that has meant that this stuff's been around now for quite a while, and there's two primary products. It's WWise by Audio Kinetic and Fmod, and Fmod, and then there's others. If you're developing in Unity, there's things like Fabric. Anyway, these audio middleware programs have meant that we can focus on learning how to really master working with those programs instead of what we used to have to do, which is build the audio tech from scratch as we're also building the game. That's a nightmare. And now it's more like, WWise is sort of the audio equivalent of, say, Maya on the animation side of things, or Photoshop in a graphic side of things. It's a program that you can spend time working to master, and when it gets plugged into your game, you're very familiar with that.
Once you mastered it, it gives you a lot more freedom for developing the sound.
Right.
So you've come a long way with BioWare from, say, Black Isle, BioWare days with Baldur's Gate, where you knew bad guys were coming because the music would go do 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 do.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, music would kick in, and you'd be like, "Oh crap, where are they?"
Right. Now, I should say that I'm with BioWare. I'm very much a contractor in that I create plenty of content for them, and then they are the ones that handle all the music implementation and functionality and design and whatnot. So I don't actually have any insight into what goes on that side of things. I can really just tell you about the content creation side, and what happens under the hood is as much a mystery to me as it is to everybody else.
Indeed.
But
so,
but I don't know if I've answered your listener's question yet. Let me see. So so I don't know. It's getting to be so deep in the weeds. Maybe this is so much more than they're wanting to know. But I like to now create interactive systems that are way more granularly modular. So I will create a system that instead of like minute-long loops of, say, a long piece of combat music that's low intensity and a long piece of combat music that's high intensity, I will try and create music systems now that are instead about 20 to 30 seconds of an idea, because I did some studying on like the pacing of film scores and did some analysis work, and it felt to me like cues would change every 20 to 30 seconds. So what I do is I like to create these systems where so combat kicks off and it looks at a sort of matrix, and it says it has a number of things it needs to determine. It determines, do you know where the enemies are, and do the enemies know where you are? And there's a whole, like, that in itself is a whole different ball of wax. Either nobody knows where anybody is, everybody knows where everybody is, or some combination in the middle. And music intensity can change depending upon which of those things is happening, because if nobody knows where anybody is, then it's more of a stealth searching sort of thing where enemies are around, but they don't know where you are and you don't know where they are, so you're seeking. If you know where they are but they don't know where you are, then maybe you get a sort of medium intensity heroic kind of thing going on. If everybody knows where everybody is, then that means guns are just blazing or lightsabers are just clashing, and now it needs to be high intensity. And so but that can change, and it can change every few seconds because of the pace of some guys can get killed and then you hide and maybe they don't know you're around, and so what I do is I say, okay, combat has kicked off, figure out where you are in that matrix, who knows where, who is. By the time that piece of music is coming to its end, take a look again at the system and see what the, maybe it started off as stealth and you're playing a stealth cue for about 20 to 30 seconds, but during that 20 to 30 seconds, you started shooting people. So now you've kicked it to a different spot on that, awareness matrix. And so it figures out what the situation is, and it plays another piece of music that is seamlessly stitched onto the last one to know where you are in that matrix. And then by the time that one comes to an end, it has to reevaluate again and again and again endlessly for as long as combat is going on. That is the new way that I'm trying to do things. It's more, like I said, more granular, more modular, and I hope that the effect is more responsive and more cinematic in that sense.
I think you're right. It's definitely a lot more natural feeling when it comes to it. Like, it's not a jarring change when you go through it, and it does feel like a movie. That's one of the things that I love about the Old Republic in general, is that the musically and the way the game is told, it feels like you're in a movie. Beyond, of course, the fact that there's always guys standing here and they don't somehow notice me when I walk by them,
right.
or beyond the mechanics itself, story-wise and music-wise, it feels like you're in a film, a very big film, and they definitely complement each other very, very well. And I think you're right. Yeah, it's definitely more a cinematic feel versus just the classic way games used to have their music.
Yes, although I need to tell you, you're breaking up quite a bit again.
What is wrong? Maybe they're running like Netflix in HD 4K downstairs. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording. Okay. I'm going to stop the call and then call back and see if that works.
Sounds good.
Now, this is a listener question. I'm not sure when you were talking about, End of the Hood is BioWare is the one who does the final putting it in the game. So I don't know how well you can answer this one or not, but I just want to know, with the Old Republic, I've put in 20-something actual days of game time in the game.
Right.
But the music doesn't seem to get old, or you don't really notice the loops as much. How do you edit in, say, the guy says, I'm assuming there's 4 to 8 hours of music in this game, but make it so when you're playing the game for days and days and days, you don't notice the seams of the loops of the music. How have you mastered the skill of just looping the music so it's seamless versus you just hear it all the time?
Well, part of it may be sheer numbers, because he's actually way off on his estimate of how much music's in the game. So when we first launched the game, it launched with 7 hours of original music itself. Add into that the John Williams music. Add into that Jeremy Soule and Mark Griskey's KOTOR 1 and 2 soundtracks that were also used in the game. And the game shipped with 12 hours of music. Let's see, that was 2011, so for the last 5 years, we've been creating new musical content for it, and they've been getting new material that they could put into the game from different sources. For instance, I forget exactly which chapter it was, but in Knights of the Eternal Throne, BioWare put the music from Republic Commando into the game to score the Mandalorians. So there is a lot of music in this game, and if I had to guess, I would say it is somewhere north of 15 hours at this point, maybe 16 hours, maybe more. So, if he's expecting there to be 4 hours, there's 4 times as much in the game. And that goes a long way towards helping fight fatigue. I think another part of it may be that I'm lucky that he feels that way, because I have seen plenty of forum posts or posts on Reddit from people saying, hey, there needs to be a lot more music in the game because I'm getting sick of hearing the same stuff. So, I'm glad he feels that there's, or she. I shouldn't assume it's a he. I'm glad that they feel that it's a lot of music and that they are getting a nice variety, because there's some people out there who don't agree. But it is even on a small game that is like a Force Unleashed game where it's a linear progression and the game's going to take significantly less than 27 straight game days to play. Even on a game like that, fatigue, audio fatigue, loop fatigue is something that you have to fight, and it's tough. It's a difficult thing to do. It's something that we have to struggle with on Mafia 3. It doesn't matter what the game is. You will never have enough music to cover the entire game with every single moment having a unique score. And it's almost silly to try to do that, because if you are spending all that time and effort and money, excuse me one second. Sorry. If you're spending all that time and money and effort to create this music, and then you hear it once and you never hear it again, I don't know that you've really gotten the most out of it. So reuse, I think, is important, and reuse is critical, and reuse is unfortunately unavoidable. So it is forever the frustration of the game music composer that you will have to fight audio fatigue.
So I just want to know, from a listener, how much say do you have on when classic John Williams cues get thrown into the mix, usually during big points in the game?
None.
None at all? They just...
That's an implementation question, so that's all BioWare's decision. And I don't know what their guidelines are for when or if that happens.
So I will ask the last listener question, and then we're going to wrap up talking about Mafia 3, since there are some questions about that one.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yeah,
hopefully the internet won't die again.
Sure.
So, your recorder's on. Okay. So the last listener question I just want to know is, we see that you're friends with a lot of fellow video game composers, including Jason Hayes, who, of course, everyone knows with World of Warcraft. And I just want to know, do you guys ever have a friendly competition going, aha, I'm catching up, and then another expansion for Warcraft comes out, and you go, darn it.
No, not really. I mean, we've never really talked about it, to be honest. I think we all just sort of talk on Facebook. There are it should probably not surprise anybody. Maybe it will, that there are private invite-only groups on Facebook that members of the game audio community have created, and so we'll get together and everybody will just sort of ask each other questions about, like, hey, can anyone recommend a great compressor, or hey, anybody have experience working with this particular plugin or this particular element of the Unreal UDK, or there's an entire one dedicated entirely to just working in WWise. So, we just sort of randomly will talk shop or talk about, like Jason has a band that he's been playing with in the last number of years, and so I'll like the posts that he puts up about his band, and he'll like the things I do where I talk about, like, this NPR podcast interview I did for Mafia 3, and stuff like that.
We'll move on to Mafia 3, since you talked about
okay.
Mafia 3. And we've known, talking to a lot of composers, from Gritsky to Sam Hulick and others, it's really rare to get an actual soundtrack release. And no, we're not talking about like the collector's edition, here's a soundtrack inside this $300 game you just paid for.
Right.
You get a statue of the Old Republic. Now, this is actual, like, released in stores soundtracks, and Mafia 3 is your very first one.
It is, yes.
I'm
so
how long ago did you find out that, A, you're going to get a soundtrack, and what was your first initial reaction to, wait, I'm actually getting a soundtrack?
So, Matt Bauer, who is the audio director for 2K, on this particular development team on Hangar 13. That's the development studio that made Mafia 3. And I worked very closely with Matt a lot on this game. And, boy, when was it? I want to say it was somewhere around... I might have found out about it while we were recording, if I remember correctly, down in Nashville in February. And I think the first thing I found out about was that it was going to be a vinyl album included. Well, first I found out that they wanted to do a vinyl album. And that was funny to me because while I have had one other soundtrack made, I can't say that it was actually a release. The creative director for a no longer in existence game company called Dynamite, they did a game called Counter Spy for Sony, and I did the music for it, and the creative director on it loved the music so much that he himself paid to do a small run vinyl pressing of the soundtrack. So it was very small and it never got released in any stores or anything. He just wanted to have it on vinyl because he loves vinyl. That was the first time I'd really had a sort of soundtrack of any kind, other than the tour collector's edition one. So then, here we are. Matt tells me Mafia 3 is going to get a vinyl soundtrack, and I think, one, first reaction, hey, that's awesome. Two, boy, this is now the second soundtrack that will exist for me that I won't be able to actually listen to because I don't have a turntable. Um, but then I find out that it's going to be in the collector's edition, and so which is cool, but it's mixed. I had mixed feelings because I know that there's a ton of music, and that you can only fit about 40 minutes of music onto vinyl, and there was a lot more than that actually made for the game. So it was a while before I actually found out there was going to be a digital soundtrack on iTunes and Amazon and Spotify, etc. So when I found that out, I was super excited, and I kind of couldn't believe it. Like I just every couple of weeks I would email Matt and I'd say, this is the digital one's really happening, right? This is actually going to be a real thing. This is I'm not misunderstanding. Like this is going to be a thing, right? And sorry, Matt, because I must have gotten annoying with that, but he kept reassuring me, yes, digital is happening. Don't worry, it'll be a thing. So, yeah, and then it just blew my mind when they said to me, and hey, by the way, the soundtrack is going to get a release a full month before the game. So it's out now. I mean, you can go to iTunes and Amazon and Microsoft's Music Store and Spotify, and you can find the Mafia 3. It's called Mafia 3 Expanded Game Score, and it's the music that Jim Bonney and I wrote for the score. It's all there on iTunes, and so it's amazing to me that so often if you get a soundtrack, the soundtrack comes out day and date with the game, and so that means that while the game is getting all of its coverage, you have to sort of shout like, "Hey, and me too! Like I've got a thing that came out too." But I lucked out, and the game is out, and the soundtrack is out in advance of the game, and so I can talk to people like you about the soundtrack well in advance of and not having to compete with all of the press about the game itself.
And this soundtrack is great. Like it's starting just at the very beginning with, I believe the track one is New Bordeaux,
right?
And it sounds like literally you got a bunch of jazz musicians together and had a jam session, and jazz and blues, I should say, and had a jam session and just let it rip. I'm assuming this is recorded live, correct?
Yes, all of it, 100%. Well, no, not 100%. There are some sample instruments in it because there are some things that we tried to do with the score that would be nearly impossible to do with live instruments, or so difficult to do that it's counterproductive to actually, like, it doesn't make sense to try and do it. Just because something's possible doesn't mean that you should do it. Doesn't mean it's a smart idea to do it. For instance, one of the textures that I use a lot in my cues is an instrument called bowed piano. And bowing a piano is time-consuming and difficult, and something that they actually can approximate really well with samples. So, yes, we recorded live bass and live drums and live guitars and live Hammond organ and live harmonica, live cello, and then the one that I'm super excited about that I don't think anybody's ever done before on a game is live stepping. We had step dancers that we brought in from Tennessee State University, and they have a step team, and we got some of their guys into the booth, and they recorded a bunch of this really amazing body percussion for me for the score.
What gave you the idea to do something like that? Because there's groups like Stomp that do it with brooms and trash cans and everything else. But like, what gave you the idea just to think of, oh, let's add body percussion to this blues soundtrack?
Well, it goes back to what I was talking about with the Old Republic, funnily enough. Every time I do a score, and maybe this is an idea that has become just deeply ingrained in me from working on Star Wars stuff, or maybe it's something that comes from, or I'm a good fit for Star Wars because I had this in me already. I can't remember which one came first. It's been so long, but every time I do a score, I want it to have a signature sound to it. I want you to, when you listen to a piece of music that I've written, I want you to be able to know, oh, that's from this project, and it's not something that sounds like any other one project. And because of that, this idea of signature instruments is a very deeply ingrained thing within me. So what I like to try and do is find these signature sounds, not just for the game, but for characters. The creative director on Mafia 3 is a guy named Hayden Blackman, who was the creative director on the Force Unleashed.
Yeah, the Force Unleashed. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's LucasArts guy.
Right. And when we started working on the game, I asked him, do you want this to be a thematic score or not? And he said, definitely want it to be a thematic score. I want the main character of Lincoln to have his own music, and I want the different mob bosses like Cassandra and Burke, I want them to each have their own themes, and Vito has his own music, and the bad guy Marcano, he's got his music. So so it became a question of, great, that works. I can do that. How am I going to do it on this score? Because I'm not using an orchestra, so it's not as simple as with the Old Republic, where you just say like, okay, one guy's tuba, another guy's cello, etc. So you wipe away the orchestra. You have to figure out what you're going to use instead, and I have this concept, this approach that I've been playing with on a couple of games now, and I really like it a lot. It works really, really well for me for inspiration, and I think it's working well in terms of the music that it's generating. It's very common when you're a composer to take a look at what is the background of your main character. What is the background of that character, or your support characters, whatever? What is the background of that character? What is their life like? What where did their parents come from in terms of what part of the world? And so you'll find guys who are composers who are scoring westerns, and even though it's a western, they know that the main character's parents were Irish immigrants, so they'll lean on some traditionally Irish instruments or something to score their main character, which is maybe a different take than what you'd expect. Or I know Jerry Goldsmith used to do this a lot, and I think I remember reading that he wanted a lot of like Catholic Church influence in his Patton score. Because of who Patton was and what Patton's background was. So that's a thing that people do a lot. But it was a little too on the nose for Mafia 3. You've got the Italian mob, the Irish mob, the black mob, and the Haitians. And I didn't want to just have Haitian music for the Haitians and Irish for the Irish, and etc.
That's fine.
So I didn't want to just, do that nail on the head approach. So I did something that I've done on a couple of different games now, where I ask myself the question, what music does that character listen to? What like in the past on games that have been more modern, I've asked myself what's on their iTunes playlist. But here it was, it's set in 1968, so what's on their turntable? If you were to walk into the living room of Vito, who's the head of the Italian. No, sorry, he's not the head of the Italian mob. He's the Italian mob kind of flunky at this point, who is one of your lieutenants. And if you walked into his living room, what would be sitting on his turntable? And so that got me to experiment a lot with all kinds of things, and so I was able to, take a listen to a lot of music that was out around then and make some interesting choices. Like I decided Cassandra was really into things like bebop, and the soundtrack to the film version of Porgy and Bess that had come out maybe I think like 5 years before the game is set. Um, and I decided that Burke is really into Van Morrison's album Astral Weeks, which had just come out at the time the game is set. And so this is such a long-winded way of getting to this answer, but then for Lincoln, one of the things I decided was that while he was over in Vietnam, I decided that he was exposed to stepping, which comes out of black fraternities and sororities around. It starts to happen around the 1940s, and by the time of the late 1960s, you were actually starting to get these stepping teams at black fraternities and sororities in the South. Actually, not just the South, throughout the country. So I decided that, stepping, which has its roots in African rhythms and military drills, that Lincoln probably would have been exposed to this stuff by other guys in his units, other guys in Vietnam. While he's there, he probably heard some stepping. It resonated with him, and so it became this sound that I wanted to capture and use as a signature sound specifically for Lincoln in the game.
And how did you mix your original music with, if I recall, there's like 100 classic, or more than 100 classic tunes from huge names also in this game, right. To give life to the sound of it. How did you mix your score in with all these classic songs that are there and make it just fit seamlessly?
Well, again, that's a lot of implementation stuff that was going to be done by 2K. So,
did you have any say on some of the songs that were put in there? Did you give suggestions saying this person should be listening to Aretha Franklin? Or
no,
something?
I didn't. But because the way it works, those tracks aren't so much used for what the people in game are listening to. It's much more what you as the player are listening to. They're used as not just in the car radio, but they're used also in cutscenes to score certain scenes. So you may you may find yourself tracking somebody through the bayou, and they will actually play Creedence Clearwater's "Born on a Bayou" while that is happening. And it's much more a reflection of the scene and what it should be in terms of what it should mean to you as the player. Um, so it wasn't something that I had any say in at all, to be honest. They told me a number of tracks that they were going to be using, but it wasn't something that I had input into. Now, that said, knowing that the game was set in 1968, knowing that the score was going to be cutting back and forth between my stuff, Jim Bonney's stuff, and tracks from like I forget exactly who's on the list, like Aretha Franklin or the Doors and stuff like that. So I was using these production techniques from the era that nobody really does anymore. Things that back in 1968 were really experimental, and rock was still pretty new, and it wasn't really until the Beatles got around to doing, I shouldn't just say the Beatles and also the Beach Boys. Everybody was playing in the studio doing crazy production techniques, and that stuff had only really started in about 1965, 66. So here's 1968. People are still doing crazy things, and experimentation was really new. 50 years later, when I'm making the music for Mafia 3, experimentation in the studio like that had not only all been done before, but like way since fallen out of fashion. Nobody's using crazy flangers anymore, and nobody's playing around with reversing tape and reversing solos or vocals on sort of run-of-the-mill standard pop and rock stuff. That's just been done, and it sounds dated. But sounding dated was perfect for this project. So I got to do a lot of that sort of stuff in creating the music. So I would run instruments through Leslie cabinet emulators, or I would record stuff and then reverse the audio and implement that back into my track so that it is a very 60s sort of sound. And so by trying to do those things that would root it in the production of the 60s, it made it so that it could move back and forth between the actual stuff recorded in the 60s and my stuff and Jim's stuff a lot more freely.
Okay, well, I think we're out of time as Skype has been brutal. So why don't you tell people where they can find the Mafia 3 soundtrack?
Sure.
And if you want to follow more of your musings and more of your music, I know the Old Republic official YouTube channel released some of your music, so just tell people where to find to listen to some of your stuff if they want to while they're gaming and so on.
That's right. Okay, so the official Knights of the Old Republic. Sorry, I'm jumping back 16 years suddenly. The official The Old Republic YouTube channel has just recently released 5 tracks. They're calling them bonus tracks. So you can go on YouTube and you can find Oricon, Yavin 4, Rishi, which I'm particularly proud of, Ziost. Ziost? This is the problem with reading development documents. I'm not positive how it's pronounced.
I'll just say Ziost.
Okay. And then the track called Shadow of Revan, which was by myself and Gordy Howe. So that stuff's on YouTube. If you want to check out the Mafia 3 score, The entire expanded game score is available on YouTube. Wait, not YouTube. Well, you can find it on YouTube, but you shouldn't. You should find it on iTunes and Amazon and Spotify and wherever else you buy music. It's out there, and that was done by myself and composer Jim Bonney. So check that out. And then you can find me on Twitter at Dunderpate Music, or at my sort of a little more, not personal, but my less professional only account, which is Oogew, OOGEW.
Okay, and of course, if people search Jesse Harlin, sometimes they'll find the other Jesse Harlin, so be careful.
That's right. Yeah.
There are two of you who compose music, and it's really weird.
That's right. The other Jesse Harlin is in Oklahoma. And even more weird, the other Jesse Harlin also has a wife named Amanda. So that's a little strange.
Well, I guess as we bid farewell, I guess we'll play some of that Rishi music for the transition out. But thank you so much for joining us and for staying on with all the
it's okay
Skype-ness.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah, thank you for the
This will be fun to edit.
Good luck.
Thank you so much, and best of luck with the future of Star Wars: The Old Republic. And I honestly don't think you're going to catch up to the Jason Hayes Worldcraft stuff, because he's, I don't know, I don't know how he does it. Someday I'll talk to him and be like, how do you do this?
Yeah.
And he'll say, I don't know.
That's
but
pretty much. Yeah, it's been a long time with a lot of music, and I don't even know how they. I mean, as a composer who works on an MMO that has been around for a long time, I can tell you, I don't know how they do it.
And I will say this, according to listeners, they want you and Mark Grisky to team up for Visceral's Star Wars title, which they're being so cagey about.
Yes, well, I can tell you that's not happening.
Oh, their dreams are dashed.
Yeah.
Don't worry, folks. Someone will do it.
Someone will, and you'll be fine with it. I know who it is, and I can't say.
And hopefully they release more information about that game sometime soon, because all they do is tease us every couple of months with, it's happening, it's good.
Yeah.
Yay. I'm looking forward to that one. But I'm also looking forward to more of The Old Republic, and I'm glad that after all this time, it's still going and still going strong.
Yeah.
And the music's just getting better and better. There's a big difference with the live. It is.
I mean,
it's awesome.
Samples are fun to get to experiment with, like I was saying, but nothing beats recording with a live orchestra.
So thank you so much for giving us so much of your time and for staying with all the technical difficulties, and best of luck with your future endeavors, and well, we'll see when we have you on again.
Yeah, sounds great.